Hello, I'm Amara Jones, and welcome to Lives at Stake, a series of critical monthly discussions about important issues facing transgender and gender nonconforming communities across the United States. This program, Lives at Stake, is a co-production of WNYC's The Green Space and my project Translash. Visit translash.org and thegreenspace.org to follow our work. Well, I don't know if you can believe it, but we are just 5 days away from the election, and we're all on pins and needles because so much is at stake for trans and gender nonconforming communities in this particular election. That's why tonight we will be talking about where the race is and what you ought to be looking for next Tuesday to help us feel a little bit more grounded and less stressed out. And if the election wasn't enough, we will also be talking about what the elevation of Judge, now Justice, Amy Coney Barrett will mean for trans people for perhaps the next generation. And we'll also be having a special tribute tonight to a pioneer, Monica Roberts, who left us too soon. Now, that is a lot of heaviness. That's why tonight we're going to have a de-stressing DJ set event right afterwards with DJ Ahmed Saeed of For the Girls, resident DJ there on the Translash Media IG page. So make sure that you join us there right afterwards to shake off all of the nerves that we hopefully will help you alleviate. But in case we don't get them all out of your system, join us there. And we'll remind you a couple of times during the show, but join us for that. So our guest tonight to help us go through all of this will be Matt Katz, who is a WNYC political reporter, among other things, who will be talking with us about the elections. Then we'll move on to a conversation with Andy Mara, who is executive director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, to talk about, well, you guessed it, Amy Coney Barrett. And we'll also have a special video tribute from Laverne Cox for Monica Roberts. So, as always tonight, this program depends upon your interaction, so make sure you interact. Give us your comments and your questions, which you can do so in any way that you're watching us right now, whether or not it be on YouTube or on the Facebook page. Use the hashtag Lives at Stake and Translash so that we can know that you want us to fold those in the program. We'll be sure to put as many of your questions and comments as we can, and also make sure that you interact with each other as well as you are leaving those comments. So do that and we'll fold those in. Now, normally, as you know, we normally begin this program with gifts, memes, things that keep us light because it's been a tough year. But unfortunately, events and an event in particular won't allow us to do that. That's why right now we're going to move on to a tribute to Monica Roberts, who left us suddenly. Monica Roberts was a pioneer for trans journalists. Through the power of her voice and pen, she demanded that Black trans women be treated with respect. And through the power of her blog, Transgrio, she fought fearlessly and tirelessly for our entire community. But it actually was the power of her humanity who spoke to so many. Laverne Cox speaks about that in a video tribute which she made that aired during the virtual funeral for Monica this past Saturday.
Monica Roberts, the Transgrio. I discovered Monica's blog, the Transgrio, probably around 2008. She had written about me. I was on a reality television show on VH1 called I Want to Work for Diddy. And when I discovered the Transgrio, I discovered a treasure trove of Black trans history. I read the names Ajita Wilson and Tracy Africa Norman for the first time on Monica Roberts' blog. And I remember being so inspired and emboldened to read these names, to read about our history and her care for documenting and preserving that history. Oh, it was everything. And I met Monica for the first time in 2012. I was facilitating a panel for the National Black Justice Coalition in Washington, D.C., and Monica was a member of the panel, and she brought such wisdom to that panel and such joy when I got to meet her for the very first time. And over the next several years, whenever I would run into Monica at a conference or at an event around the country, she always had a smile and she had uplifting, incredible things to say. I always went to Monica's blog to find out what was going on in our community. I can't even imagine not going to her blog, not seeing what she had to say about a particular issue. Her loss is a monumental loss to our community and to the world, but it is our job to continue her legacy, to always honor everything that she stood for. Thank you so much, Monica, for everything you've done for us, for lifting us up, for lifting me up. And we will continue to try to do that for you, your work, and your legacy. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Monica. We honor you, and as the Jewish saying goes, may your memory be a blessing. You continue to live within all of us. Now on to the heart of our show. For real. And it's fitting that we, after the tribute to Monica Roberts, have as our first segment a conversation about the election. That's exactly as she would have wanted it to be. We are, as I said, just 5 days away from the election, where not only will ballots be cast for president and vice president, but of course, thousands of offices across the United States. Here to talk to us about where the race stands tonight is Matt Katz, who is right now a political and campaign reporter for WNYC, among many other beats as well, including immigration and sadly hate groups. So we're so thrilled that you are here with us, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Mara. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So let's begin with the basic question, the title. Where do you think the race stands? What is the state of the race 5 days out?
Yeah, it's what the most amazing part of where we are right now is that 80 million Americans have already voted. So we're like almost like halfway through election day in a sense. And in Texas alone, the number of people who voted is almost equal to the total electorate back in 2016. So there's a strong interest and strong motivation out there for people to be out and voting. Now, where it stands in terms of who's winning, Joe Biden has a 9%, approximately a 9% lead nationally. The website 538 simulated the election 40,000 times as they do, and they to determine like who would win in all the different kinds of scenarios. And Biden wins 89 out of 100 times. Now we've seen close races before that were supposed to go one way, they went the other way, and that's why everything totally comes down to the swing states. And if one or two swing states are close, they could really determine this thing and flip it back in Trump's direction. And then if not, we're potentially in for a protracted court fight that could end in the Supreme Court. And I think the bottom line is that people should not be like opening a beer and a bottle of wine on election night and expecting to like know what happened by the end of that night. We're not going to know. I can't imagine we know, even when we wake up in the morning. I think this is going to take days, weeks, maybe months to be certain who the next president of the United States is. And then there's all kinds of variables that could happen the longer this goes. I mean, this could end up in Congress if there's a dispute in a state. There's weird shenanigans involving electors that could happen. The people that like get sent to Washington to actually cast the ballot on behalf of the voters. And then, of course, it could end up in the Supreme Court, as it did 20 years ago. So tons of uncertainty, and I think everybody should buckle in. We're in for a bit.
Yeah. Now, I think that, part of what we want to do tonight as well is to allay people's fears. I think we've just dialed them all the way up, possibly. I mean, I think that a couple of things that are important to note is the fact that everyone, has memories of 2016. One, unlike 2016, the polling in this race has been extremely stable, almost for all year long. And also Joe Biden, has cracked 50%, which Hillary never did in her polling. And so for statisticians, those are significant things in this race. We'll come to some of the things that we should worry about later. I think one of the questions that I think is really important is what people should look for. So if Joe Biden is having a good night, what does that look like? When people are looking at the returns as they come in, what is a positive direction? Even if there's no resolution next Tuesday, what does a positive direction for Joe Biden look like on Tuesday? And what does a positive direction for Donald Trump look like as you're at home on the couch with bourbon and popcorn?
Right, as I will be. I think there are a couple of states that people are going to want to pay attention to. Pennsylvania is probably, that's all the prognosticators are indicating that's the most important. That if Biden has a comfortable lead in the day after the election, it's going to take them a couple of days to count the votes there. But if he has a early lead there, that would be a good sign for Joe Biden for sure. If he doesn't win Pennsylvania, there are other. If it doesn't look good for him in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, Florida are backups. And then there are these two states that, a year ago, nobody would have thought would be in play. Georgia and then Texas. If Joe Biden is leading in Texas, it would essentially be game over. He's now in striking distance, according to polls, a couple points out. And that's an extraordinary thing, not just for Joe Biden in the next 4 years, but really for the future of this country. If Texas is blue, the whole dynamic and where things break down politically and the direction of the country in terms of the legislative and executive branch are going to change dramatically. So if there are Biden supporters out there who want some optimism, they should look at some of these Texas polls. They're pretty amazing. And then it's really the flip thing for Trump. He's got to win Texas and he's got to win Pennsylvania. What he's doing though, and what he really needs to do is to suppress the vote. That's his game. He's never won. He's never had most of the country in his corner. He didn't win 50% of the vote in 2016. He never had 50% of the approval ratings in this country. So he needs to suppress the vote, and they've been pretty overt about that. He's got lawyers in all these states working to, contest ballot signatures, block access to drop boxes where people are dropping off their ballots, videotape voters as a form of intimidation. So that's his best chance to win. If there's a lot of that going on election day, then you might be concerned if you're a Biden voter. If there isn't, if things go pretty smoothly and people are saying they've been able to vote and there's the lines are, people are able to handle the lines, then that would be a good sign for Biden folks.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also alongside of that is that two of the states that you mentioned are fast counting, right? Like Pennsylvania is not fast counting, but Florida is a pretty fast counting state, and so is Texas. And so if Joe Biden, even if he loses Florida by a little bit, it's probably, as you say, a sign of a good night for him. I would also say in Texas. So keep your eye on some of those fast counting states. And as you say, Georgia, if we go to bed on Tuesday night, as you say, and may not be called, but Joe Biden's ahead in Georgia, they're going to be really happy.
Totally.
So you mentioned voter suppression, and I want to turn to another part of what you cover, which is about sort of hate groups and militia groups in that realm of our society. And Donald Trump has been pretty explicit in urging them to show up at the polls. They have a website called Army for Trump, where you can enlist yourself to poll watch. He's signaled to Proud Boys and to others like Oath Keepers that they should be very vigilant in coming to the polls. Those are all armed groups. So I'm wondering, is this just rhetoric, or you think that this is something that we actually have to be concerned about? There are, a lot of people who are in some way marginalized in society, who may have issues at the polls. If these armed groups show up, like Black people or trans people or others, I'm just wondering, is this something that people actually have to be concerned about, or is it just kind of rhetoric as every year?
It is certainly rhetoric, and it is not dissimilar from the rhetoric he pulled in 2016. He also then called for people to show up at the polls and to watch them, and there's going to be sneaky stuff that people in urban areas are going to do, he alleged. In that case, we fortunately did not see many major incidents, and I would expect that would be the case now. I mean, the targets in these respects would be people in cities, people of color, therefore, in cities that are swing states. So like, Philadelphia, Atlanta. And in those cases, we have to hope that the local authorities are aware of, any people that might be coming by trying to intimidate, and that there's enough manpower on the streets that understand the need to protect the sanctity of the right to vote. It is certainly scary. The other element of this is not just on election day at the polls, but what happens immediately after. Are Trump's QAnon supporters going to, if Trump loses, accept the fact that he lost? They already don't think. They already are describing mail-in voting and early voting as a fraud and as a hoax. So if there are violent QAnon supporters, which there already have been isolated incidents of violence by people who purport to follow this wacky set of conspiracy theories, also extremely anti-trans set of conspiracy theories, they could take to the streets in the days and weeks after the election to protest Trump's loss. Or if there's a contested election that might its way through the courts in some way, that would also give an opportunity for the far right to take to the streets in a violent way. We have to hope that the vulnerable people living in the cities that we're referring to here have some degree of protection from local law enforcement. And we know historically that's certainly not the rule and often not the case. But that's what we have to hope for.
I just want to tell our audience, if you have any questions about the elections or comments, please send those in now. One of the things I wanted to ask you as we wrap up this segment, I have a feeling we'll be asking you to come back, is, so you mentioned that we could go to bed not knowing who won the race, and that we shouldn't necessarily be concerned about that. I am wondering when you think people should be concerned. So if we wake up on Wednesday and we don't know, it's fine. When would you advise viewers to say, okay, this is when we should be worried about where we are in this particular race or in this election?
When there start to be court challenges and injunctions that say things like stop counting the votes because there's an allegation of fraud. And when Trump lawyers are requesting that ballots stop, that the count stops, and then the judges agree with them, and then maybe it starts to go, further up the chain. We want, as Americans, I think, every vote counted, and fair, whichever way it lands. And that's when I would start worrying about small d democracy in this country. And the further those legal challenges go and the longer they go, then they will end up being decided by fewer and fewer people and ultimately end up in the Supreme Court as one possibility, or in Congress. And we don't want that. We want the American people, the 300 plus million American people, to be making a decision about who the next president of the United States is. So I will start to get stressed out by this thing, more stressed out than I am already, once we see a lot of court challenges and injunctions to stop counting votes.
Well, let's hope we won't get there. Maybe all this is just we're being alarmist, and when we wake up on Tuesday morning, we'll have a clear result, but we shouldn't bet on it.
That's so possible.
Hopefully everyone, the whole point of this conversation was to forewarn everyone so that they are prepared for the things that could come. I want to thank you so much for coming on and helping us talk through those things and issues, and good luck out there in the last 5 days of the campaign trail. And we hope that you'll come back. Thank you so much for coming on.
It would be my pleasure. Thanks so much, Amar. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. That is Matt Katz, who is, in a very intrepid, fearless manner, reporting on the 2020 campaign and presidential election. You're watching Lives at Stake. We also wanted to just remind everyone before we go on to our next segment that remember that afterwards we're going to have a special DJ set, and that DJ set will take place on the Trans/Media Instagram page. It's going to be awesome. I will be there. I'm looking forward to it right afterwards because I need it. I need it too. Maybe I need it possibly even more. I don't know, just last week, or actually this week, it feels like it was last week, but just on Monday, Judge Amy Coney Barrett was elevated to become Justice Amy Coney Barrett, giving the conservatives a 6-3 majority. Oh, I'm sorry. You just heard my iPad go off. Giving the conservatives a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court, perhaps tipping the balance on an array of issues, including and especially those focused on gender and including gender identity. That's why I am thrilled to be able to unpack what all of this might mean for transgender nonconforming communities tonight with Andy Mara, who is the executive director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. Andy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Amara. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I love the TLDF background. It's very, that shade of bluish green is very tricky, and you guys have nailed it in your background. So have to appreciate aesthetic things and at this moment and in our community all the time. So before we actually go into Judge Amy Coney Barrett, and we already have questions from our audience about her and the court, which I think underscores people's concerns. Can you just give us a quick overview of where we are on trans rights in the Supreme Court so that we can, better evaluate what her being on the court means?
That's a great question and a great place to start. So even though time has fused together because of the ongoing pandemic, I want to take listeners and viewers back to June of this year. In June, the Supreme Court delivered a historic and landmark ruling for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people across the country. In a 6-3 opinion, the Supreme Court ruled that trans people and more broadly LGBTQ people were protected under existing federal law in the instance of employment. And what was significant about this ruling was, number one, this was the first time the Supreme Court had ever heard a trans-specific Supreme Court case. It was the first time that a trans person sat in our nation's highest court to represent themselves. And also it was a historic moment for our movement in that that case was led by trans attorneys, including Gabriel Arkels and Chase Strangio, both of whom are at the ACLU. And so to see such a significant win, a win that affirmed that LGBTQ people are protected nationwide from employment discrimination, was huge. I think even more dramatically, even back then, before Amy Coney Barrett had been nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Court, it was a 6-3 win. And Trump at that time had already nominated and confirmed 2 Supreme Court justices, and chief among them was Justice Gorsuch, who wrote the majority opinion. And so what that means for LGBTQ people and trans people in particular is that we were able to deliver a persuasive argument using conservative legal arguments in order to demonstrate to the justices that LGBTQ rights should be protected and are protected under federal law. But I think it's also important to note that the current administration for the past 3.5 years has been incredibly busy with nominating federal judges on the bench. And we've seen a record number of over 200 appointments to appellate and district courts, many of whom come from conservative spaces that have anti-trans background. A good example of that is Judge Kyle Duncan, who is an appellate judge, and prior to being appointed to the appellate court, Judge Duncan was very much active with opposing HB2 in North Carolina, and also was also opposing as counsel the Gavin Grimm lawsuit that the ACLU brought involving a trans student and being able to access school facilities that affirm their gender. So even though we saw the significant win with Bostock, the fact of the matter is the courts have dramatically shifted to include a number of conservative judges, some of which include judges that have anti-trans records.
Thank you for that overview. I wanted to ask you what is concerning about Justice Amy Coney Barrett's records that makes people concerned about her presence on the court and the way that she can impact these issues?
A great question, and I think this was certainly on the minds of trans people when she was nominated by Trump. And I think what's important to note is her existing record, and public statements that made it really clear that she is an opponent to not just transgender equality, but also LGBTQ equality. In the perspective of TILDEF, it would seem, based off of her record and past statements, that she would not be capable of being able to be an objective justice when interpreting the law with regards to cases that may come before the Supreme Court as they pertain to trans rights. I think another good example is the company that Justice Barrett has kept over the years. She has multiple ties to anti-trans organizations, including membership in the Federalist Society, which is a conservative judicial group. She has participated in speaking engagements with the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank in DC. And she's also delivered paid lectures by the Alliance Defending Freedom, another legal advocacy group that is adamantly opposed to trans rights and has also been designated a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So if you look at her affiliations alone, it's a strong signal of how she would be applying and interpreting the law as a justice. And I think, more explicitly, if I were to continue to go down the list of receipts,
No, you don't have
you
to
know,
go down all the. You don't have to go down all the list, because I think you've made the point of ways in which she's like frightening. Unless I shouldn't have said that, but concerning, for trans rights. I'm wondering though if there's something in the receipts that you think stands out as like the most giant of the red flags. Clearly, there's a long list.
well, very briefly, in
Yeah.
3 points, she's openly condemned Obergefell, which led to marriage equality
Yeah.
across the nation. She has opposed or condemned Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins, which protects or prohibits sex-based
Wow.
stereotyping in employment. And then finally, more specific to the trans community, she, at one of her talks that she delivered with the Alliance Defending Freedom, she consistently misgendered transgender girls and women, and in her remarks, she targeted trans children. And I think everyone would agree that children should not have bullseyes on their backs in any matter.
Yeah. One of our audience members, Dee Barrigo, asks if we should be concerned about the Supreme Court making a legal definition of sex that excludes or discriminates against trans people with her presence on the court. Is that one of the concerns? Is narrowing the definition of sex to exclude us?
I think that's a great question. I would say right now there is decades of case law that have established the category of sex to be inclusive of not only sexual orientation, but gender identity. And even though she was recently confirmed to the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court were to hear a case regarding whether or not the category of sex included trans people or not, she and others would be going against decades of case law that has firmly established that the category of sex includes transgender people.
And what before I ask my final question, one other thing did occur to me is, with her being on the court, who does it empower or embolden, and who does it not empower or embolden or undermine when it comes to our rights? I mean, clearly the court is going to tilt rightward, but is there a hard right that we're concerned about her aligning herself with to tilt it even further? Or, do you think that she would be more in the center right mold of Roberts or Gorsuch? Where on this spectrum of people on the right do you think that she would fall with her colleagues on the court?
Well, her case law has been limited. She has, prior to being confirmed to the Supreme Court, she had only been an appellate judge for 2 years. So a rather short period of time before she was formally nominated. But look, what's I think concerning and should be concerning for trans people as well as LGBTQ people more broadly is that we have a couple of Supreme Court cases that are coming up soon. And by soon, I mean as early as November 4th. Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, the Supreme Court is going to hear oral arguments about whether or not private agencies that receive taxpayer funding, federal taxpayer dollars, to provide government services, specifically, we're talking about foster care providers, food banks, city missions, homeless shelters, about the question of whether or not if these kinds of providers are able to deny services to people who may be trans. And that's a tremendous matter for the Supreme Court to hear and to determine whether or not religious exemptions, how far religious exemptions go. The second case that I would point to is California v. Texas that's coming up on November 10th. And this is a lawsuit that could determine whether the Affordable Care Act is constitutional. And Barrett has been a vocal opponent to the ACA, And if the Supreme Court strikes down the Affordable Care Act, more broadly, that means 22 million people across the country who receive their healthcare coverage through the ACA will be gone. And I think what's telling, especially in the moment that we're in, all trying to, navigate an ongoing pandemic, there are 9 million people across the country who have contracted COVID. 228,000 people have died. And if the ACA were struck down, that means that 9 million people who have contracted COVID have a pre-existing condition that would not be covered because the Affordable Care Act was struck down. Now, more specifically for trans people, and this is really the crux of it, what's great about the ACA is something called Section 1557. And that contains an explicit non-discrimination provision that says LGBTQ people should have access to healthcare coverage, period, full stop. And if the ACA were struck down, that would mean that trans people, LGBTQ people, among a number of groups, would not have access to equal healthcare coverage in this country.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And lastly, what do you recommend to people who are concerned now about the shift on the court with Amy Coney Barrett? What can be done about that? We've gotten a couple of questions from the audience as well. That was also my last question that I'd written. But that, what can people do? And what should people do, if anything? Should people get behind certain court reforms, or should they be doing other things? What can people do?
It's a great question. And I think this ties also in with how many of us are thinking about the potential outcomes of the election. And I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. One, as a movement, as a community, we need to pass the Equality Act.
That's right.
First, we need to pass the Equality Act. It's a federal bill that's passed the House. We need it to pass the Senate. We need it to be signed into law. Essentially, the Equality Act would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation with regards to employment, housing, public accommodations, education, federal funding, credit, etc. We need a federal law to close the loop on whether or not trans people are protected. So that's number one. And I think, obviously the outcome of the election will determine how we move forward as a movement in advocating for that piece of legislation. The second thing, though, that I think is really important for our movement to remember is that it doesn't stop at the Supreme Court. And I say that because often we do look to Congress, we do look to the White House, we do look to the Supreme Court for answers. But I really do think in the moment that we're in, local and statewide organizing and advocacy are really important. We need to be mobilizing our communities in our backyards. And I think given the deep polarity in our country, and I think a lot of fear-mongering that has occurred, especially with regards to trans people and victimizing our lives and our experiences, we need to invest in democracy building work. And I think where we need to start that work is in our towns, in our cities, and in the states that we reside in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because we know that the Koch brothers and other people have invested in thousands of judicial races across the country to get the type of judges that they want, where a lot of these particular cases and rulings, especially in a lot of the state laws that are anti-trans and pending, would be really important. And so, as you say, we're focused on the federal and we're focused on what's happening in Washington, but we also need to pay just as much attention and be involved in these local races, because that's where so many of us live in places that may or may not be friendly towards us, and who the judges that would be ruling on our cases are really, really essential. So Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for the work also of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. We really appreciate your work and your leadership and the time that you took in an incredibly excruciating time of the year to come and talk about these issues. Really, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mara. And the last thing I'd like to say is make sure to vote. And if you need resources on your legal rights about voting, visit tldef.org/vote.
And if you need legal resources about a great many things, go to the TLDF website. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
You too, Mara. Take care.
Cheers. That was Amy Mara, who is the Executive Director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund based here in New York City. Well, we've come to the end of our program, and we hope that our conversation tonight has helped put you a little bit more at ease about the election next week. If you have any concerns about voter or voter protection, there's so many resources next week. But one of the things that Matt Katz referenced is that people may protest the counting of votes. Well, there's also an organization called ProtectTheResults.org, where if that happens in your local community, you can visit that website and see what you can do to help protect your vote and the votes of your neighbors and the votes of democracy. That might be important if that is your fear and your mindset. So that's ProtectTheResults.org. And specifically focus on trans politics in 2020, including the races involving trans people across the country, as well as a focus on trans people in red states, where half of trans people in the country live, are not in blue states. You should go to our website, translash.org, and listen to our latest podcast. It's got a very simple name, Trans Politics 2020, where you can catch up on those things. And I promise you'll leave hopeful. That's actually a very, very, very hopeful conversation about where we are going politically in places across the country. Remember to join us if we haven't allayed your fears enough. Right now, go to Translash Media on Instagram for our DJ set with DJ Ahmed Saeed, who is the resident DJ at For the Girls, a really important organization doing work in our trans communities. So go there. I'm going to go there right now. I'll be there until they turn the lights off because we need to let off a little steam. Be safe, be well, and remember to vote not only, but if you got an absentee ballot, you need to now walk that physically to some place to be able to cast that because it's too late to mail. So early vote and go to the polls on Tuesday and make your voice heard. It only happens once every 4 years. And this year is as important as ever. Be safe, be well, and we'll see you next month on November the 19th. Thank you for joining us on Lives at Stake. I'm Amara Jones.